Massachusetts, Honorable Senator Joyal.
Honorable Senator,
Honorable Senators, after 23 years of assiduous participation in the Senate sittings, 10 years in the House of Commons, and nearly 20 years as President of the Canada Liberal Party's Political Commission, Quebec Chapter, I'm rising for the last time in this chamber in order to share with you some thoughts arising from my legally mandated departure. I would like to think with you about the dynamic forces which, even after 50 years, are still keeping me just as engaged in public life.
the political train that I have traveled on for over 50 years is finally arriving at the station. Literally, since we sit today in the concourse of the National Capital Old Union Station. For me, it's the end of an exceptional trip, but not the end of my commitment to this country. Allow me to share with you some personal thoughts that this long journey of public service brings to my mind. Honorable Sénateur, il n'y a pas de...
Honorable Senators, there is no cause that is more noble or patriotic than that of defending
l'existence même
the very existence of one's country and of directly contributing to nation building. Generations of Canadians have engaged in this work before us, many even making the ultimate sacrifice. We should never forget this. I have had the privilege of serving during an extraordinary period in Canada's history, during a time when twice in less than 15 years, in 1980 and in 1995, two referendums were held to decide the very future of our country. I took part directly in these two campaigns with deep conviction, the latter one as the Liberal Party representative on the No Committee. Senator Nolan was representing the Progressive Conservative Party for his part. I also took part in the debate right after the October 1980 referendum, when I co-chaired the special committee which was charged with founding a new Canada. In 1982, our full constitutional authority was repatriated from London, giving Canada total control of its destiny as an entirely sovereign country. A Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created in order to guarantee an ideal of equality for Canadian citizens, an ideal based on the nobility and the dignity of each human being. This humanistic conception, Honorable Senators, is a vision of an ideal of free humanity. That ideal has always been one that I have held dear, and it has spurred my participation in public life ever since the beginning. It is that ideal that I have attempted to defend every day in the Senate, on every possible occasion. On many occasions, I've done my best to transform the conditions of our common existence in order to build a society that respects the individual choices of each individual, as well as opportunities for each individual to develop freely according to his or her own character. In 1980, I passionately intervened to defend the existence of Canada against Quebec separation because I was convinced that our country, Canada, offers us the opportunity to develop a society in which anything is possible, open to each and every individual who is willing to take on the challenge of being open to others, whatever their language, religion, race, origin, ability or disability, social status, gender, sexual orientation, or their economic condition. Of course, I was not unaware that the French fact is in a minority situation in Canada, and that many others before me in Acadia and elsewhere in the country had struggled sometimes vigorously to defend their identity and language, and that there will always be pressures on our language due to the dominant demographic and cultural weight of English in America. I was also just as convinced, however, that effective legislation could create a balance which would give a broader space to the French language, and that this balance would be supported by a majority of citizens speaking other languages throughout the country who would choose to opt for the humanist advantages of identity and cultural pluralism. That is the Canada that I was defending in 1980, that I defended in 1995, and that I have always sought to promote in the Senate. Not that the independence of Quebec is not, in itself, a worthwhile option to consider, since drawing back within one's borders could be a reflexive instinct for those seeking to protect their identity. But personally, I have chosen broader values. I have chosen to try to build a space for freedom and respect for my language, calling upon the most generous forces in our nature, openness to others, the recognition that our differences is a strength, and that we must set our compass by an ideal of freedom which leaves space for openness and valuing different cultural identities. I made that choice consciously, freely, because it is anchored in my values of civilization. I felt that turning towards freedom in this manner would be the most exalted challenge of a lifetime, but that it could not be separated from the existence and the defense of strong institutional protections to guarantee that that ideal would not be eroded due to the vicissitudes of circumstances and even crises. On the contrary, these guarantees can assure that this ideal remain resilient, to ensure that it does not wither and dissolve over time. On the contrary, to ensure that it becomes stronger and is nourished by the spring of our conviction that it is the way to move towards a future that is of a society that is more open, more tolerant, with greater solidarity, a society which can act as a haven of peace and hope in a world which is increasingly prey to divisions, sectarianism, poverty, and violence. Canada, a country where all of our differences can expect respect, appreciate each other mutually, and value each other. To sit in the Senate's legislative chamber is a privilege that cannot be compared to any other in our public life. In the police, the city, to use the term used by Plato and the other Greeks of antiquity. As a senator, both individually and together in groups or members of a party, we have enormous power. Our consent is required for the valid adoption of each piece of legislation in this country. We study legislation launched by the government, but we also debate all the issues that matter in our world. And we can also explore all the dimensions of the possible opportunities that might broaden or improve the space of our common freedoms. In other words, the Senate is not simply a chamber to resist government bills. No, it is a place where we can nourish better conditions to develop the values that define us. That is to say, the protection and the broadening the rights of minorities and marginalized individuals. For example, those who are in the prison system or those with intellectual disabilities, and also to protect regional interests. That is the fundamental advantage of our chamber. It is not subject to the whims of the short-term electoral process and vulnerable to the pressures of voters who, today, are themselves assailed by a horde of social media that include both the best and the worst of humanity. No, the Senate is a chamber of deep thought which can take the time to take a critical distance, which can offer greater objectivity and independence, and which can take the time to temper passions. That is the aspect of the work of the Senate that strikes me as particularly important, and that I wanted to share when in 2001 I decided to publish a book on the Senate, a book entitled Protecting Canadian Democracy, The Senate You Never Knew. My colleague Senator Mercer mentioned that book. Why did I publish this book? I wanted to bring another perspective to the table. At the time, there was a mantra that was constantly being hurled against the Senate. It was constantly said that the Senate was powerless, deaf to citizens' concerns, and detached from the real nature of Canadian society. Instead, honorable senators, I believe that the true function of the Senate is fundamentally linked to our federalist principle, which defines our form of government. The identity and autonomy of our regions, especially Quebec, are clearly laid out, as well as the status of our two languages and the rights of minorities to respect and the protection of their identity. That is what makes us different from a unitary country, institutions which guarantee to each and every individual true freedom of choice and greater liberty. We have chosen not to be Americans, not by default or because of a feeling of contempt, but instead because we prefer to base ourselves on a vision of humanism with a different conception of freedom than the ideal of freedom held by our neighbors. Our conception values duality of language, diversity of identities, and a more generous vision of social solidarity. I have always defended that vision of our institution in various books, a great many articles, conferences, and even when I pleaded this vision personally before the highest courts of our country in 2013 at the Appeals Court of Quebec and even before the Supreme Court of Canada. The ruling handed down in April 2014 clearly established the parameters of the constitutional nature of our institution, its role, and its particular function in our federal system of governance. That ruling of the court, in favor of which I intervened, meant that Prime Minister Trudeau was able to recommend 49 senators to sit without any political affiliation. How many of these senators would be here today if for each one of them they had to run in an election in order to be here in this chamber? That is the system that had been laid out in the 4 bills tabled by the previous government. I'll let you think about what that would have been like. But what I wanted to underscore is that others worked here before you with independence, and these senators paved the way towards your role today. It was a unique privilege for me to work both as a legislator and as member of the Quebec Bar for over 50 years, to be able to intervene directly before the highest courts in our country, more than 9 times, in order to plead the case of various essential principles of our country: the equal status of French as an official language, human rights against an abusive interpretation of parliamentary privilege, defending the Senate's constitutional character and its particular responsibility towards the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms when it comes to reviewing legislation, as well as understanding the scope of the institutional principles that anchor our parliamentary democracy and constitutional monarchic system. Such interventions had never occurred before in the political history of the federal parliament, and I am still extremely grateful to the tribunals that gave me this opportunity. And believe me, I always took the greatest care to respect the professional ethics which were critical under these exceptional circumstances. I have never thought that one should limit oneself to the text of legislation and study legislation literally without really understanding or evaluating the true effects of this legislation for certain groups, minorities, and marginalized individuals. The Charter lays out rights and freedoms which must be assessed against the evolving backdrop of our society. They are not fixed in time. They change, and they must be considered from the point of view of those who are directly affected by bills, not simply assessed insofar as they affect the majority in society. And that is why, for example, in 2001, with Senator Wilfrid Moore representing Nova Scotia, that is why I proposed an amendment to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, so that sentencing would take into account the specific situation of Indigenous youth, who, as we know, are greatly disadvantaged in the justice system. The amendment was carried by a single vote, even though the Minister of Justice at the time stated publicly before the Legal Affairs Committee that the government would not accept any further amendment and that the bill had been sufficiently improved in the House of Commons. After the amendment was adopted, Prime Minister Chrétien was furious. But the House of Commons ultimately accepted this amendment, aiming to protect Indigenous youth struggling with the justice system. In 2000, supported by independent Senator Michael Pitfield, who some of you may have known and worked with, I tabled an amendment of great political importance for the future of Canada during the debate on the Clarity Act. The amendment sought to formally recognize that the primary responsibility of any Canadian government is to defend the integrity of our country before considering any negotiation initiative regarding the separation of Canada. This was a tense debate. The government opposed the amendment with all the means at its disposal. It was ultimately defeated. But the argument being made ultimately struck all ears. It is the undeniable duty of the Government of Canada to unreservedly defend the existence and survival of our country. I had personally recommended, prior to this, in a confidential memo to Prime Minister Chrétien after the 1995 referendum, I had recommended to seek to obtain from the Supreme Court the clarification of conditions that would legally apply if there were ever a third separation referendum, in order to ensure that the country would not become a hostage to provinces that could at any moment trigger referendums on separation. And that further, only the secessionist province would be able to interpret and validate the result. The debate on the amendment to the Clarity Act was a debate about the very survival of our country, and I felt that it was extremely important that before dismembering Canada, the government's absolute duty to unreservedly defend the integrity of our country should be clearly stated. The most passionate and lengthy debate, honourable senators, which occurred almost every day over a period of more than 3 months, was the debate that occurred in 1999 on the amendment tabled by Senator Jerry Grafstein and myself. This was an amendment regarding limiting the Minister of Justice's extradition power towards countries with the death sentence. This specifically targeted the United States, where the death sentence still exists in 29 states. We alleged that this section of the bill went against Section 7 of the Charter because effectively it reestablished the death sentence. In the House of Commons, members had completely ignored this issue. Once again, the government deployed its arsenal to defeat the amendment, even though we asked that it be a free vote, as there had been a free vote when the death sentence was abolished in 1976. Given that this is a personal, moral question, the government even informed Senator Sister Peggy Butts that federal grants to her charitable organizations would be suspended if she did not vote as the government desired. The Speaker of the Senate at the time, the Honourable Gildas Mulgat, was ordered by the government to vote against the amendment. Nonetheless, voting in line with his personal convictions, his independence, and his responsibility as a senator, Speaker Mulgat voted in favor of the amendment. A short time later, he was removed from his position and became once again an ordinary senator. Sadly, he died only a few months later. In January 2001, I went to his funeral in Winnipeg with the Governor General of Canada, Adrian Clarkson. The amendment was ultimately defeated in the Senate after receiving unimaginable pressure. But that was not the end of the debate. A year later, in a ruling of the Supreme Court, United States versus Burns and Raffey, stated that this provision of the extradition law was unconstitutional. In the ruling, the Supreme Court stated that it had noted the debate that occurred in Parliament. Honorable Senators, history always remembers the courageous, exemplary, and inspiring gestures made by brave individuals and forgets those that bent to the will of others. It is difficult to imagine a stronger and clearer expression of independence. Independence is more than a convenient label that we claim. Independence is a value that we have clearly displayed in the past in our institution and in the very clearest fashion. There is another debate that is still continuing today. The debate related to an amendment to broaden the protections under Part 7 of the Official Languages Act, which was presented on several occasions by the late Senator Jean-Robert Gaultier between 2001 and 2004. The government at the time wished to oppose an increase in protections for minority Francophone or Anglophone communities. The government would thus constantly adjourn the debate in order to put it off, since Senator Gaultier was going to have to retire shortly. In public, the government always stated that it supported the Official Languages Act and boasted of various financial investments made to support the Act's objectives. And ultimately, Senator Gaultier had to leave the Senate before the amendment could be adopted. Senator Claudette Tardif and I took up the cause and pushed the government to stop avoiding its constitutional obligation. The amendment was finally amended in 2005, but the regulations that were supposed to be passed as a consequence were never ultimately made, which made the provision practically obsolete, as the federal court judged in 2018. Acadia and all minority communities are the ones paying the price for this. Unfortunately, I will not be among you to contribute to debating and adopting an act to modernize the Official Languages Act, which has become a vital necessity. Honorable Senators, there is a long list of the amendments and bills that I have tabled or inspired over the last 23 years, and I would be abusing your good natures if I were to mention all of them, but I will mention a few. I would like to mention the amendments to the Anti-Terrorist Act during the national security crisis after the events of September 11, 2001, in order to give real status to the special advocate. I would like to mention Senator Gold, in order to protect the principle of the presumption of innocence and the right to an impartial trial. The amendment was defeated, given the pressures of the government, but ultimately the substance of the amendment was reestablished later after a ruling of the Supreme Court. I would also like to mention amendments made in 2016, which some of you mentioned earlier, with the support of Senator Cowen, in order to remove the test of reasonably foreseeable death in the bill on medical assistance in dying. The amendment was adopted by the Senate, but defeated by the government in the House. We know what happened after that. The Superior Court of Quebec ruled during the election campaign a few months ago that this test was unconstitutional, went against the Charter, and the tribunal gave Parliament 6 months to amend the law. Unfortunately, I will not have the satisfaction of voting among you in 2020 in order to reestablish the amendment that we tabled, and which unfortunately the majority in the Senate, giving way to government pressures, did not ultimately insist on in order to protect the dignity of people who are suffering incurable and intolerable suffering. I would also like to mention the amendment presented in 2018 with the support of various senators on the Canada Corporations Act, to guarantee that real progress is made to ensure that there be gender balance on boards of directors of large companies in accordance with the principle of gender equality in the Charter. The amendment was defeated, but this is still a very current problem. According to the numbers published by the Diversity Institute at the University of Arson, women in 2019 made up only 24.9% of positions on boards of directors.
I could also remind you of the amendment in 2018 to fight against tax havens, as presented by Senator Carignan, that I strongly supported during the debate about legalizing cannabis. The amendment was defeated, but now we know that organized crime has infiltrated the world of growth permits for medical use cannabis, as recently revealed by an investigation on the proceeds of crime by the Montreal police. The proliferation of tax havens go against the principle of equality amongst citizens, the principle which is at the very foundation of wanting to live together in democracy. The battle against this social scourge must be led if we do not want the gangrene of populism to spread in this country and erode the very foundations of our freedom. Or the amendments presented by Senator Dalphond, which I defended, the need of which I defended as chair of the committee, and that I strongly supported last spring to protect the principle of judicial independence in Bills C-58 on the Access to Information and C-337 on the Judges Act and the Criminal Code. In a law-based society like Canada's, we cannot weaken such a principle without imperiling at the same time the entire edifice of the protection of our rights and freedoms. Several amendments were brought to the Harper government's bills amending the criminal code were defeated, then re-established following Supreme Court decisions. Allow me to remind you that these courts regularly follow debates in this chamber when they have to do with deciding upon a question of law before questioning a parliamentary act. It's often happened that the courts specifically mention arguments raised during our debates, and that happens, in fact, 7 times more often than House of Commons arguments are raised, as the former Senator George Baker liked to remind us. And then we have these privileged moments where we can directly contribute to changing fundamental social relationships to make them more equal, as when I sponsored here in the Senate in 2005 the adoption of the Civil Marriages Act, an act that is now supported by over 80% of Canadians, or the bill that I introduced in 2008 with the support of Senator Andrzejczyk to establish a regulatory system that would better protect the rights of parliamentary employees that were victims of abuse, or 3 successive bills that I presented in 2009, 2012, and 2015 to have Indigenous languages recognized and promoted, bills that the government finally adopted and that we proudly adopted in June 2019, giving Indigenous peoples the dignity of their identity, an identity of which they had been robbed for over 150 years. The history of our country changed course then. Or, finally, the last bills that I introduced yesterday in the chamber. One, to prohibit conversion therapies for young people, already presented in April 2019, and another one amending the National Capital Act to protect our heritage here on Parliament Hill and our monuments and national historic sites. I remind you of all these amendments and bills either tabled or initiated over the years to tell you about some of the teachings that I recall from my time here. First of all, it's not whether one adheres to a political party that erodes the independence of a senator. I believe I have illustrated that by reminding you of some of the debates in which I directly participated in the past or was personally associated with. A senator's independence is first and foremost one's self-defined set of values, following one's experience in life, the sense that we have of our own lives, the values that a senator chooses to defend, the vision a senator has of a freer society, and the initiatives that each of us is ready to take to promote them during committee work or public policy debates in the chamber, or introducing our own private bills, as each of us can do. This independence is also about our own personal will. Are we prepared to take a personal risk in opposing the government's desires, perhaps the desires of the Prime Minister who appointed us? And in some cases, as in mine, that Prime Minister may be a close friend, which happened to me several times over the course of these years in discussions with Prime Minister Chrétien, who had himself appointed me to the Senate, and to whom I am profoundly grateful for having taken the risk of appointing me and recommending my appointment to the Governor-General, or opposing a government who wishes to see its legislation adopted at any cost and as quickly as possible. Or might you choose to simply express your point of view and to vote, despite your own values and own personal convictions? This independence can also be defended and rationalized on a purely democratic way. The greatest weakness afflicting Canadian democratic institutions, as recently demonstrated by Professor Donald G. Savoy in his book published on November 30th of this year, is the concentration of executive and legislative power in the hands of the Prime Minister and a few close acolytes. That is the greatest scourge afflicting our system and which tends to spread despite all commitments to reform. But the Senate has true legislative power, first to guarantee the federal principle and the respect of the rights of minorities. If it chooses to simply be a chamber that provides advice, no matter how wise that advice may be, without ever insisting on fundamental rights or the respect of our country's constitution, it fails in its fundamental role. In such a case, the Senate will be easily manipulated, especially if senators isolate themselves in their respective individuality and do not act as a group or as part of a group with a defined political orientation in order to counter the enormous power of the Prime Minister and the government apparatus. Honourable Senators, I advise you to reflect carefully before changing the rules about the length of debates in this chamber. The government, any government, will always find clever ways to benefit from any particular situation as much as possible, or any breach weakening this chamber's powers and independence. I remain convinced that the Senate can also be a privileged forum to make the Order of Canada's statement real and tangible, desirous of a better country. It's quite possible, and I'm telling you it's true. By basing my choices on my principles and values, I am personally convinced that a senator is what they do. Better is always possible. It's up to each of us to define what we do. At our presumed age of witness, to cite the theatrical director Enrico Casagrande, I prefer a stormy life to a life of rest. Intuitively, through my own taste, through my sense of duty, I seek the storm. In my case, Mr. Speaker, art, reflection, and a thoughtful life are this storm that leads us to do better. The art is political because it acts upon this world. It also transforms us deep within ourselves. I was always a little fearful about men or political men or women who remain at arm's length from history, culture, cinema, literature, theatre, museums. This is what Cicero, the Roman senator, said over 2,000 years ago. They do not entertain the science of thought. Life did not begin with us, and life will carry on without us after we're gone. Reflection is what we are. And that's what freedom represents in our time, in our world today. And one can only fully appreciate all of this by taking part in every aspect of culture. We have a responsibility to broaden our memory and the horizon of our freedom. If we do not understand what history has to teach us, both in exaltation and in the worst horrors, how can we truly understand and appreciate what we must do? For example, in this very country, it's a certain idea of the superiority of one civilization as compared to another that led to the creation of residential schools, a horror in our history that we must never forget and that must guide us in the path to reconciliation and a better governance of Canada. Our human solidarity is what led us to welcome, in 2015, 25,000 Syrian refugees. They were fleeing destruction and certain death. We opened our hearts and our doors to the suffering of other peoples. It is truly art and culture that help us see the best and what is possible in men, the most luminous possibilities that connect us to our common humanity and give us a better understanding of our public's commitments. Thanks to the support of the Canada-France Interparliamentary Association, as well as the Library of Parliament, the Senate chairs, especially the Honourable Senator Fury, that I personally thank, but also Senators and former Speakers Houssakos, PC Nolin, Noel Kinsella, Hayes, and Mulgat. Over the years, I was able to organize 5 different symposia in the Senate. The first one on the relationship between France and with France in 2008, a second one on constitutional monarchy in Canada with Senator Houssakos in 2010, a third one during the centennial anniversary of the First World War in 2014-15 on the process of political transformation that was provoked by the war in Canada, a fourth in 2015 with the Faculty of Law of the University of Ottawa on Senate reform, going beyond an amendment to the Constitution, and finally a fifth in 2017 to mark the 150th anniversary of Confederation, to help us reflect upon where we are as a country. And I would like to particularly thank the Honourable Senator Seidman for having agreed to chair that symposium. That initiative, as senators know, was accompanied by the creation of the 150th Senate anniversary of the Senate Medal. And I thank my indefatigable colleague and friend, Senator David Wells. This medal was proudly received by 1,000 Canadians in recognition for their volunteering. Perhaps the Senate should make that a permanent annual program, which would continue its relationship with volunteer Canadians who improve living conditions around them. Each of these 5 symposia led to the publication of a major work, and some of which received awards, which are a concrete testimony of our thinking on our maturity as a country and the particular character of our national identity. Let us not forget, of course, the initiative with Senators Fortin Duplessis and Willie Moore, who allowed us to create a commemorative calendar on the occasion of Her Majesty Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee, which is placed at the centre on the clerk's table and whose costs were paid by personal contributions of each of the senators and staff of this chamber.
To our respect for the head of state and Her Majesty, and I'm deeply grateful to the other senators who have been involved, and singularly Senators Noel Kinsella, who brought his patronage to this initiative. Mais ce qui m'a procuré l'une des plus...
But what gave me one of the greatest satisfaction and joy was to closely collaborate once again with the Canada-France Interparliamentary Association, with Canada's various ambassadors from France, 16 in all. Since my election in 1974, starting with Ambassador Jacques Biot, all the way up to the current ambassador, Madame Karine Rispal, in order to deepen the history of the singular relationship between Canada and France and better understand what our two countries have in common. This allowed us to strongly support the defense by Canada and France of the rule of law and the respect for human rights in various world fora, which are the United Nations, the G7, the G20, the OECD, and, of course, the International Organization of Francophonie. I also, together with Senator Grafstein and then with Senators Linda Frum and Patricia Bovey, to promote a project for the National Portrait Gallery in the former American Embassy across the street from Parliament and convinced the Prime Minister Chrétien to go forward with that. Unfortunately, that project was abandoned later on by subsequent governments. I also was able to draft many articles in special publications, such as the Supreme Court Law Report, La Revue Parlementaire Canadienne, university publications. I published historical essays. I gave special conferences in universities and other places of learning, and made speeches before professional associations. All of these contributions illustrating how much the Senator's position can provoke reflection, study, and debate, and move ideals forward that are at the very foundation of the vitality and the type of society that Canada is. And I didn't have to be absent from the chamber to do all this because perhaps at a certain point it was decided that I was collecting too many chairmanship allowances, as if one could work too hard. I leave you having tried to contribute to improving our institution and protecting its reputation and its integrity. Along with Senator Andrzejczyk, I was able to participate as of 2004 in drafting a code of ethics and in appointing an ethics advisor who could be completely independent to ensure that the Senate did not have to go through the same battles as the House of Commons over the last two governments, a battle that lasted 3 years, which did not prevent me from defending senators' privileges and promoting a better understanding of their role and responsibilities when the Auditor General intervened in this chamber without truly understanding the roles and functions of a senator. For 15 years, I was chair and vice chair of the Ethics Committee because I was convinced that the public confidence in the Senate was fundamentally dependent and related to the rigor with which senators applied the principles and rules of our code. The inaction of a single senator has repercussions on all of us, and we all pay the bill. I encourage you to pursue reviewing the Ethics Code following the report that was tabled last August. This chamber's integrity and honor depend upon it. I leave you after having donated for the edification of future generations all of these Indigenous works of art, which are now an integral part of the daily environment of the Senate, and those 9 portraits of the kings of France, as well as 3 portraits of English kings that will be presented in the foyer in order to better understand and appreciate our original our political, legal, and cultural origins. And to remind you of the authority and that we have in the institution of the Senate. I must thank the Speaker and his office, the Senate Clerk and her office, the Procedure and Chamber Affairs Bureau, the Usher of the Black Rod and his team, all of these groups that serve us in a disinterested, independent, objective, and incredibly efficient and effective way. Everything I already mentioned and many other things could never have taken place without the love and affection of my immediate family, the person with whom I share my life, a passion for thinking, writing, history, and art, without a team of devoted, loyal collaborators that always make sure everything is impeccable and exemplary. For those which are here in the gallery today, I see Alain Landry, Normand Villega, Momar Diagne, my dear friend, Aram Adjemian, and I have so much admiration for the courage he had in telling us about the origins of the Armenian genocide, and who remains so committed to defending the interests of this community that's so ill-treated by history, and especially Mr. Sébastien Payette, who has shared my parliamentary daily reality for over 15 years now. They are examples of true loyalty and true friendship, true and sincere friendship. I remain eternally grateful to them. They know that they can count on my feelings of affection for them, for their children, for their spouses, and for their families.
Not limited to standing up for fundamental values when they are being challenged directly. It is also being engaged through the vigilant defense of these values when they are compromised through measures that are motivated by convenience. The nobility of public service is a reward in itself. It does not need to be sustained, praised, or recognized, but simply a self-awareness that the cause of public service is a good in itself. J'ai véritablement aimé le Sénat.
I have truly loved the Senate.
J'ai véritablement.
I have truly loved the Senate, honorable senators. I leave it with a personal debt towards each and every one of you. I have been happy here. I benefited from your sincere consideration and, in many cases, warm and and very stimulating friendship. I've truly appreciated our debates, which go to the very heart of the exercise of democracy. Different ideas come up against each other. Discordant voices can coexist. This goes to the heart of the health and vitality of our democracy. I thank you, those of you who expressed divergent points of view from mine. They helped further my reflection. I hope, dear senators and honorable senators, that our paths will cross again in the future. And if the destiny of our country is ever imperiled, and the ideal of freedom and liberty that we have requires us all to respond all in the same voice. Let's go forward. Long live forever Canada.